relationship between the United States and Turkey, a maturation of that relationship, as Turkey moves from, and this has already begun, moves from being a client state to a partner and sometimes competitor, so that in some places there's going to be very, very good cooperation between Ankara and Washington, and we are all going to benefit from that. In some places we are going to disagree and we're going to have to stay out of each other's way. Mm-hmm. And then in some places we are clearly going to be working at opposite ends, and we are going to work at opposite ends on those issues. That doesn't make Turkey different from other important allies in the United States, and it doesn't diminish Turkey as an important partner for the United States. And I think that this is some nuance was lost in the kind of Turkish navel gazing after President Obama was there in April 2009 and talked about this partnership. And there are going to be, as I said, there are going to be places where partnership is called for and where we work very well together. And in other places, you have two countries that are going to be independently seeking their interests. That does not, to my mind, portend a breach in relations. It portends headaches, but I think the relationship is too important for it to be undermined by these differences. And I think that what would be smart, and something that the Obama administration is doing, is looking for other under-the-radar screen type issues in which to build the foundation of the relationship. So when we do confront a situation where we disagree, Arab-Israeli conflict, for example, Iran, although I think this situation in Syria suggests that maybe Turkey may be propelled in a different direction with regard to Iran. But nevertheless, in those places where there is a cushion, there's something in the bank that we can work on. And those areas are, we can be partners in energy. We can be partners in development in Africa, in North Africa, and economic development in North Africa. Those are places where it would be productive for us to work together, or allow the Turks to take the lead with an American hand. If we do those things, and we do those things successfully, we can have a normal relationship. We have disagreements with our major allies. We work hand in hand with them in some areas, and in some areas we don't. And I think that reflects a more mature relationship. I think it's wrenching, though, for people in Washington that have this notion, that have this idea that's been built up over time that, Turkey was a country we would call them up and say, hey, we'd like you to do this, and Turkey did that. It's a different country now.
Thank you. Thank you for your answer again. So now the floor is open to your questions. Please tell us your name and affiliation, and then your question.
William Jones, Amnesty International, USA. Right before the election, Erdogan, I believe it was, announced that the women's ministry was no longer going to exist and it become a family ministry. Was this merely a play to his conservative base, or is there something else behind that?
I'm sure here's more.
Well, actually, it is discussed in the way that you presented. But when you look at the composition of the new parliament, the deputy or the woman deputies number increased. And I don't think that the change of naming, I don't think that the name of changing ministries is related to AKP, AK Parti's conservative ambitions. I don't think it in that way.
I agree.
Okay. So, any other questions?
Yeah. Hi, Peter Fettner. I'm a freelance writer. I read yesterday or today that there are 52 journalists in prison, and the article is the Carnegie, I think, who said it, Carnegie down. They said there were 52 journalists who were jailed in Turkey, and then they also said that there were more journalists jailed there than anywhere else, which I found very hard to believe. If that's true, does the election represent any hope for them getting out, or any loosening up of civil society?
if you talk about domestic politics, the most difficult questions we have to answer. President Abdullah Gül made a statement about the position of these journalists. Most of these journalists are in jail not because of their writings, their expression of opinions, but because of their ties with some suspected relations with terrorist organizations. They are under the trial. So, of course, we can criticize Turkey because of these journalist issues, but Turkey is passing through a silent revolution. I mean, Turkey is becoming a more civilian and democratic society. There are so many generals in jail as well. They are there not because of fun. They are there because of getting rid of military tutelage, and there is a strong suspicions of some attempted military coup against the government. So we should not think just looking at the one picture. We should see the process and the whole picture.
I have a different view on this. I think that first, I think that AKP and its supporters have had a number of different explanations for this, none of which are satisfying. One is, well, it's the law, it has nothing to do with the government. And the other one is this, that these guys are not being held for being journalists, they're being held for other activities. It's too neat. The arguments are too neat, and I don't think that they wash. I think that this is indicative, and in fact, Turkey's scores by reporters, Freedom House, on this issue are quite low. And I think it's in a generous way, it's reflective of the fact that Turkey is undergoing a transition from a semi-authoritarian system to a more democratic system. But we don't know for sure that it's going to end up at that democratic system. I think the test will be how and what kind of constitution, how they go about it and what kind of constitution that they write, that hopefully will have these kinds of protections. But the argument that this is the law and it has nothing to do with government, well, this government has been in control of the parliament for 9 years. They could have easily changed the law in order for this kind of thing not to happen. And what is particularly extraordinary, and I mean this out of great respect, but that there hasn't been more of an uproar among Turkish journalists about their colleagues being in jail. And this is for a government, for a party that has done so much and can point to tremendous achievements over the course of the last decade. This will remain a stain no matter how you try to spin it or argue technically that these reporters were not being journalists when they were being arrested. They were being arrested for something else. I think it raises a whole host of questions.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you could comment on the status of Turkish-Israeli relations. You talk about Turkey, there being a sense of Turkey emerging from the planned state to sort of more of a partner with the United States and there going to be more consistent disagreement on certain issues. Where are Turkish-Israeli relations? What do you see as being necessary to move forward in that?
Relations are clearly at an impasse, and there's actually, from what I understand, very little communication between the two governments, and we are stuck on this issue over the Mavi Marmara, in which the Turks demand an apology and compensation, and the Israelis say we have nothing to apologize for, and we don't pay compensation to terrorists or terrorist sympathizers. I don't know how you get beyond that. Certainly, there have been gestures over the course of last year. I think it was deeply appreciated that the Turks dispatched a firefighting plane when the big fire happened in northern Israel. But beyond that, we're essentially nowhere in relation. And this is something that divides the United States and Turkey because it's a political issue. It is largely a political issue. Given Israel's popularity here in the United States, poll after poll after poll, it's good politics for people on the Hill to side with the Israelis on this issue, regardless of how you view the principles of the matter. So in that sense, it's also difficult for the Obama administration in dealing with two close allies on this issue. Now, it is true that there continue to be business contacts and so on and so forth, but by and large, at the political and diplomatic level, the two countries are estranged and will likely remain so for the foreseeable future.
I agree with Steve. I don't expect any improvement in the relations between Turkey and Israel in the near future, because after the Mavi Marmara incident, the relations between Israel and Turkey is becoming more and more domestic issue, and without acceptance of apology and compensation, the Turkish government will have difficult times in explaining what changed. Because in the last election, the issue of Israel was an issue of election. Both leaders, Erdogan and Kılıçdaroğlu, used Israel as an issue of election. So it's becoming more and more issue of domestic politics. Maybe we can expect no more deterioration in the relations. That is the first step. We should keep it. And then we can have some commercial and touristic good relations. Maybe in the medium and long run, we can expect some good relations.
Let me just add one more point on that as an active moderator. If you remember again, like Steve's words, in terms of alliance between Turkey and US, the basic thing was Soviet threat. So that disappeared, and then Turkey and US started having more problems during the last 2 decades. So I think we have similar situation with Israel, because Turkish-Israel alliance was depending on the securitization of the whole Middle Eastern politics. So now that basis is lost. So what's going to happen after the Arab Spring, and what kind of region we will have, I think will be really helpful to solve or to deteriorate this question. So whether Turkey will be more cooperative, or whether Israel will be more cooperative, or how they will really restructure their own foreign policy responding to new conditions in the Middle East.
Let me just respond to the active moderator here on a number of points. First, I don't think that the flowering of Turkish-Israeli relations were really a function of securitization of the region. I think it contributed to it, but I think it was really a function of Turkish domestic political struggles, and the Israelis took advantage, were able to see an opportunity in that. And it was also a function of the fact that some shrewd people in Turkey, I'm not sure who exactly they were, recognized the fact that they didn't have a natural constituency here in Washington and wanted to sign up and reap some political benefit of having good relations with Israel in order for help here in Washington in confronting Turkey's domestic political, I don't want to use the word enemies, but opponents here in Washington. And I think that was a shrewd policy that largely worked. But I think that there was strategic benefit for both countries, but it was short-lived in the sense that as Turkey emerged as a more democratic and open society, public sentiment runs not with Israel but against Israel. That is an issue that, as pointed out here, both Prime Minister Erdogan and Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu have used to great political benefit, which is ultimately an obstacle to one of the obstacles to renewed relations. If Prime Minister Erdogan and Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu believe that they have a domestic political benefit by either bashing the Israelis or cooling relations with the Israelis, there's very little that anybody can do to get over that. Now, over this question, who's going to be more cooperative, it's a false question. The Israelis have nothing whatsoever to do with the Arab Spring. If anything, the Israelis are nervous about what's going to happen, and you can make the argument that they would have to adjust their foreign policy, but given the kind of bounded rationality of Israeli national security, decision makers in the foreign policy establishment, there's likely to be more retrenchment than change, given the nervousness that they've lost a strategic ally in Egypt. They are estranged from Turkey, another regional power. They perceive an enormous threat coming from Iran. They're worried about Jordan. This is not, from the perspective of Israeli decision makers, an opportunity for them, but a moment for them to retrench. Turkey has assets that can be deployed in a changing region that Israel just clearly does not have. So I don't think it's I think that in this, kind of in the underlying point of your question or your statement about a competition between Israel and Turkey in the region, it's not really a fair fight, and we're talking about two countries with very different relations and attributes in the region. Even if some new Israeli government emerged that wanted to be more flexible, let's say, in dealing with the Palestinians, the Israelis are not in any position to be doing anything in a way that can be at all construed as an ability to influence what's going on in the Middle East. The United States can't do that, Turkey can't do that, and so the Israelis aren't in a position.
Okay, thank you. And Amy, please.
Tom Dine with the Search for Common Ground. A couple of times I've heard the word civil society used, with no definition and no discussion of depth. Can Turkish civil society institutions and people work with the Syrian opposition, whatever civil society there is in Syria? I don't think there is one. Can Turkey play a role in preventing all-out civil war, violence going way out of hand? So you address Turkey's influence, if there is, on Syria's evolution.
Actually, Turkish civil society is a robust society, is a live society. From economic institutions, organizations to human rights organizations, we have a whole range of civil society organizations. But on the side of Syria, as you said, we do not know what kind of civil society we can find there, because Syria is the most authoritarian, most repressive regime in the Middle East. And now Syria has a strong army, and it's very difficult to demolish Assad regime for the time being. So, but despite of this difficulty, there are some meetings in Turkey. In these meetings, people came from Syria, Syrian opposition, and I think the fourth meeting will be made very recently. But Turkey, from the start of the Arab Spring, from the start of the Syrian unrest, Turkey tried to use its influence over Assad regime to make him reform, more shocking reforms. But until now, it seems that Turkey is not successful in doing that. But the question is that who can do that? Maybe the alternative is the military intervention, UN military intervention. But this would be very dangerous to the unity of Syria and to the unity of the whole region, because the Syrian unrest is very related to Lebanon and even Palestine and Israel. So still Turkey and the international community, including the UN, the US and Britain, should work in collaboration in putting a pressure on the Syrian regime to make this reform. What's next? It is said to be some military buffer zone within Syria can be established, but this means that there can be some possibilities of war. So this is very dangerous, and well, these are the considerations. But for the time being, there is no clear option, clear solution.
Very quickly, I think that the Syria situation demonstrates the limits of official Syrian influence. Prime Minister Erdogan, Turkish influence. What did I say? So Turkish influence in Syria. They invested quite a bit in Bashar al-Assad over the course of the last decade, and have been unable to move him in a direction that's constructive. And I think it represents the fact that the Syrian position has been, when it comes to a crisis, the only country that they can actually really rely on is Iran. And they are clearly relying on Iran. Now, what happens in post-Assad Syria? Certainly, Turkey is well positioned just by dint of geography to play an important and constructive role. And Turkey should be commended for what it's doing now to provide whatever humanitarian relief it is to people who are managing to cross the border, even as the Turkish government is only recently thinking about a post-Assad Syria. If there is a post-Assad Syria, then there is an opportunity for Turkish non-governmental organizations, as well as the Turkish government, the U.S. government, the Saudi government, and others, to try to help the Syrians rebuild their society. But I'm not Uncle Rifat killed 30,000 people in order to save the regime in 1982. I know it's a very different world 30 years on, but it suggests that the Assads recognize they have so much to lose. And in a weird, abstract way, Syria looks a lot more like Libya than it does Egypt or Tunisia. So this is not going to be something that's going to be quick or very, very easy. I'm afraid there's no common ground. We continue to search for it, but I'm afraid right at this moment there's not a lot of common ground.
Both of you basically said this. Turkey's civil society institutions have no influence.
They have no influence, and look, we're looking at a situation in which a leadership perceives they are in an existential situation. So what I'm saying is, should we come to a point where there is something, a post-Assad Syria, then it is entirely possible for Turkey's robust non-governmental organization sector to have an influence. But we really won't know that until we get to that. It's an empirical question.
Just one example to that. SETA organized a meeting 2 months ago and invited one expert from Syria who had nothing to do with the opposition, but when he returned back he was put into jail and he stayed there for a couple of months. Now it's more than a month or so. So I mean, these are the examples. So especially after the opposition meetings which were organized by civil society institutions in Turkey really angered Assad regime, but I don't think had real influence inside the country. So I agree with all our speakers that I don't think civil society at any level from any country has any influence whatsoever right now inside the country.
Panelists of the National Institute of Istanbul. My question is, what is the real story behind the harsh exchanges between Erdogan and the Economist magazine? Then a short question, if the constitution changes fail in the parliament and go to the national referendum, what are the chances of winning the 50% in the national referendum?
We were just discussing the Economist magazine before we walked in. I quite honestly, I thought it was one of the most bizarre episodes recently that the Prime Minister of Turkey, a country with the 15th largest economy in the world, poised at the time to win his third election, sealing his place as perhaps the most important Turkish politician of his generation, and well positioned to write a new civilian constitution which would seal his fate as one of the most important Turkish leaders ever, should take on the Economist magazine over just what is a routine kind of economist like that. It was bizarre to me. I don't think there's any secret or real story behind it. I thought his response was disturbing, to say the least, to suggest that a magazine is controlled by what did he call it? Zionist gangs or something, or international, whatever the code word was, it was, the magazine is controlled by Jews. He didn't say anything about it when the magazine has praised him for the previous 9 years about the magazine being controlled by Jews. So I think that this was a bizarre episode, and I think that Prime Minister Erdogan needs a good friend to sit next to him and tell him when to close his mouth sometimes.
What did the magazine say?
It said that they should vote for the CHP.
International gangs.
National gangs. Well, we all know what that
International gangs.
it's not too far from international gangs to international bankers.
Any response?
The most positive aspect of the discussion of economists was that the international coverage of Turkey is on the rise. But for the Turkish side, I think Erdogan used this as something useful for the election campaign. That's it. For domestic reasons.
Because he took it as interference in
Yeah.
internal affairs of Turkey.
Yeah.
I think he's a brilliant politician, but I would give him that.
Yeah, Turkish people are discomforted with this idea of intervening in Turkish domestic politics.
But having said that, I mean, the tone of the economists, not economists, but the international press, I think there is heavily Eurocentric tone on whatever is written on Turkey to some extent. For example, New York Times, the day after the elections, in their coverage, they say, like Turkey barely escaped from authoritarianism and that kind of language. I think, I'm not talking about the economists per se, so I'm not saying that what were the reasons and such, but the international coverage of Turkey, I think it's very poor because of the vocabulary they use, not because of the because of how they describe what's going on. So, second part of the question.
The referendum,
Anybody?
if it goes to referendum, what are the chances of winning?
I think the chances are very good.
Will be
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, first of all, the Justice and Development Party, and in particular Prime Minister Erdogan, have demonstrated that they are really masters of the political arena. And I'm not kidding when I think that he is one of the most important politicians of the generation, and a master politician. I don't know whether he used the CHP thing. He thought about it. I think he reacted emotionally, and I think that you believes the same thing. I hope I didn't just ruin anything for you. But I think that he is a brilliant Turkish street politician. Absolutely astounding. Not only that, I mean, I've met him twice, and I'm ready to vote for him. So the criticism aside, so I think that if it comes to that, if they manage to overcome some of these issues on the Kurdish issue, he approaches it in the way in which he approached governing from 2003 to 2007, compromise, pragmatism, consensus. I think that they can get a document, they probably get a good document, and with the power of the AKP and Prime Minister Erdogan, I think that they can get it. And I think he will live in history if they can get it.
Short answer.
Yeah, short answer. Erdogan is very good in taking votes and in shaping public opinion. I think if he can succeed in making the new constitution passed from Parliament, he can easily take the necessary vote from the people. But the problem is in the Parliament.
So technically, he needs 330.
If he fails in the parliament, he takes it to the...
No, he
can't do
can't
that.
do this.
I thought your question
he
was...
needs 330 deputies in the Parliament.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
if he does not get
voting
it,
for. Sorry.
if he does not get it, can he go to the referendum?
No.
No.
I didn't know that.
So he needs couple votes to get through the parliamentary process. So,
Thank you. Jamal Borzenji from the International Institute of Islamic Thought. Normally I have one question for each one of you, two respective speakers, for Dr. Burhanettin. The fear in the United States and the West in general is that Islamists are getting hold of such a powerful country like Turkey, and the fear that what happens after this additional credibility and credit that Erdogan got, is he going to shift more towards radicalizing the politics of domestic and foreign policies of Turkey, or is he going to have free hand to further moderate his stance and can resist pressure to radicalize? For Steve, please, you see that if Egypt is going to rise and be democratized, hopefully go successfully for this spring of theirs, then they might then shift off the focus on Turkey and the Arab Middle East and so on. While the other reading is Islamists, both in Egypt and Tunisia, are looking to Turkey as a model, a functional model of coexistence of democracy and Islam. So why don't we see that possibly they will still continue to look at the model of Turkey and they will build better cooperation regionally to sort of manage the rest of the region? Thank you.
The question of Islamism is significant in terms of how the Western media looks to Turkey. But I think the discussion about Islamism is not relevant to Turkey now, because Turkish Islamism, since the early days of the Republic, is not something here in Washington people think that this is Islamism. Because Turkish Islamism, Turkish Islamist demands are based on headscarf issue and some religious freedom for education, for religious education. That's all. So if you ask about the radicalization, even Turkish Islamism is not radical. And when we came to Erdogan, we cannot call him as Islamist any longer, because he changed his mind in the late 1990s. This is simply because of the realization that when you are becoming integrated into the world, when you are internationalized, you cannot keep your strong Islamist demands, and that's why, so that's why we cannot call it as Islamist. And I cannot expect any radicalization of foreign policy. Turkish foreign policy is not Islamist. Maybe it's nationalist. Turkey is trying to become more independent and powerful in its region, of course, with cooperation with Western allies, Western friends. That's it.
Just as a side, I agree with that. I don't think when people say Turkey is becoming a radical Islam, I don't understand. Doesn't fit for me. On this question of Egypt, there is no doubt that the Ikhwan and are looking at the Justice and Development Party experience and wanting to learn from it, and are deeply intrigued by it, and are wanting to take advice from the Justice. But these are as important as these movements are, and in particular the Ikhwan in Egypt, as important as it is. It represents a slice, an important one, but a slice of what is now a flowering political environment in Egypt. And let's also be clear, Egypt is 80 million people. It's about a quarter of the Arab world. The home to Al-Azhar, center for Sunni learning centuries. And that as important as Turkey is in terms of learning lessons or as for offering advice, even Islamists in the Arab world are going to look towards Egypt should it become successful. But just because of the historical weight of what Egypt is, a lot of the good things that have permeated the Middle East have come out of Cairo, and a lot of some of the bad things also. Egypt really is. It's not a cliche to suggest that it is a bellwether of the region, and as important as Turkey may be in terms of integrating economically in the region, there is a difference, despite a kind of pan-Islamic worldview. There is a difference between Turkey and the Arab world, we have to acknowledge. There is a legacy, a colonial legacy there. And most important, the uprisings in the Arab world right now are part of a process in which Arabs have been responding to foreign domination for the better part of the last century and a half. And as Turks may be brothers, but they still represent something different. And Arabs are now looking forward to the opportunity to write their own history. They're willing to take advice when they ask for it, but they want to write their own history. And that's why I think that there would be, should Egypt in particular be successful, a diminution in Turkey's overall political influence. That doesn't mean it's going to go back to being a tepid observer of events that it once was. It's just not going to be this oversized power that it seems to be right now, or wants to be.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ali Aslan, Zaman newspaper. We all know, I think, who will win the Turkish elections in economist newspapers and others, given their editorial stance. Well, I was wondering if there was a ballot in Washington, who would win the Turkish elections, especially in the foreign policy circles. What is your analysis of that? And in connection to this question, do you think the United States is leading the transformation in Turkey efficiently and correctly? And what should and could the United States do to have perhaps a better leader?
Thanks, Ali. Good questions from a good friend. I think that AKP would win in Washington, but it would be close. Closer than 50% to 25%. I think that JHP would certainly breach that 30% threshold that I was hoping for. So maybe Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu should run for something here. I think when you ask, is the United States reading it, it depends on who we're talking about. I think that the folks over at the White House certainly understand the importance of Turkey and have from the very beginning wanted to work with Turkey as a partner. Were somewhat, I think, as was everybody across the government, somewhat dismayed about the events last spring. But as I pointed out, correctly understood that AKP would win, and does see the Justice Development Party as a transformative force in Turkish policy, largely for the better. And I would say that for the administration at home, because the president sets, especially this president, it sets the tone for American foreign policy, and by all reports has developed a good working relationship with Prime Minister Erdogan. On Capitol Hill, there's certainly less nuance to the way in which people view Turkey's transformation. Although there are people there who recognize it. I don't think Turkey's been punished in any particular way for anything over the course of the last year or so. And then, the people like me who, don't have the influence, can't press a button. I think we're largely divided on this issue, and there's a lot of good and there's some bad as well. But I think that overall,